Hello and welcome to the next video that you've got for your A-level history course on Anglo-Saxon England and the Anglo-Norman Kingdom. Today's lesson we're going to be looking at the dynamic between King William II, or William Rufus, and his brothers in the 1090s and the latter half of the 1080s as well, just a little bit on that. We're going to go up until about 1094. We could very easily talk about the Scottish campaign because it does form an important moment between William Rufus and Robert of Normandy, but we're just going to gloss over it very quickly because we're going to return to that in a later video and lesson. So our main focus of today is to outline the events following the 1088 rebellion involving the three brothers. It is quite a unique set of twistings and turnings that we see. It's surprising as well to see how the dynamic changes and the fraternal bond that binds these three individuals together is quite surprising. We're then going to look at why William Rufus appeared to get the best deal. So what decisions does he make over this particular time, and what mistakes do the other two individuals make that means that William Rufus by 1094 is in a far better position than the other two. And finally, to see if we can actually make a decision whether or not we can summarise or categorise the dynamic between these three brothers. Now, we're not going to do a 20-mark question, but it's always important for us to consider where this potentially could lead into. So if the question was something along the lines of William Rufus was able to put down any threat to his reign as a result of the serious flaws of his enemies, well, we could talk about the 1088 rebellion, and we could talk about the events that we're going to be looking at today. So really, this is a timeline study between 1088 and 1094. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through a number of key events and key years between 1088 and 1094, and for each one we're going to see how the dynamic changes between these brothers. So we've done living graphs before. You've got a copy of this particular sheet. You need three different colours, so you need one for William and Henry, one for William and Robert, and one for Henry and Robert. And what I want you to do is, as you're listening to the events and the discussion about each particular year, I want you to plot where you would place these particular relationships. So for example, if you think that 1088 that William and Robert were complete allies, then you would plot it at the top and you'd write a brief description as to why that would be the case. The reason why we do these living graphs again is to look for particular moments where there might be a dramatic shift, and also to see whether or not the dynamic changes between the individuals quite significantly or drastically at certain points. So let's begin with the fallout from the 1088 rebellion and what we covered in our lesson from Monday. So we know that William II is victorious after the 1088 rebellion, but let's talk specifically about the dynamic between the different individuals. So we know that Henry the Clerk and Robert of Normandy were in support of each other to try and destabilise William Rufus and put Robert of Normandy in charge. Obviously that would benefit Henry. It's one less brother, more territory and control and more power for him. And Robert of Normandy, it makes complete sense. That would mean that he could unite the kingdom. But we know that Robert doesn't travel over to England, and we know that Henry doesn't during the rebellion as well. So the two brothers, William's two brothers, aren't in open revolt against him. And it's interesting to see what Henry does at the end of the 1088 rebellion. You'll remember from Monday that William Rufus showed clemency, showed mercy to those people that had rebelled against him. And Henry does quite an interesting thing. He's trying to take advantage really of William Rufus's clemency and mercy at this point. And he decides to leave Normandy and in the autumn of 1088 travel to see his brother William in England. He asked that all the lands that had once belonged to their mother, so Matilda, should now be given to him. So Henry's been given some money from his father when he died. Now Henry's wanting more. He's wanting titles and land in England. In Rufus's eyes, though, Henry'd done nothing that deserved rewarding. He'd supported Robert of Normandy. He hadn't gone to the aid of William during this rebellion, and Henry got nothing. William said, "I'm not going to give you anything from this, and instead I'm going to give it to somebody who's actually supported me during the 1088 rebellion." So he gives it to Robert Fitzhamer, who's the son of the Sheriff of Kent. Henry's quite surprised by this, and returns back to Normandy really with his tail between his legs. It's interesting then to see how Robert responds to this. So we know that William and Henry have fallen out, and Henry's been rebuffed by William Rufus. But let's turn our attention now to Robert of Normandy. He didn't go to England during the 1088 rebellion. He remained in his court in Normandy. And following the clemency of William Rufus, he's now got those chief architects of the rebellion in his own court. So Odo of Bayeux. He's also got some other individuals like Edgar Atheling, and you'd think that they might rally around him, but instead they're disgruntled, they're angry at the fact that the rebellion hasn't been successful. And what we start to see from latter half of 1088 and more into 1089 is that Normandy is becoming increasingly destable. And we already know that he's got issues in terms of money, but now we've got warring noblemen fighting for control in different parts. And Robert becomes paranoid from this. So let's turn our attention firstly to the dynamic between Robert of Normandy and his brother Henry. Henry's been rebuked by William Rufus, and he's returning to Normandy. Now, you'd expect Robert to welcome him in. That would mean that he's got a larger court, he's got other powerful figures that are surrounding him. And if Henry has been rebuked by William Rufus, maybe Robert can get him onto his side. You know, they have worked together already. But it's interesting to see what happens. Henry returns to England with the Duke of Alençon, and Robert of Normandy is sceptical and wary of what the Duke of Alençon and Henry have been doing over in England. And in actual fact, he doesn't think that they've been rebuked by William at all. He thinks that they've been sent by William to destabilise matters. So interestingly enough, at the very start of 1099, we see real tension between Henry and Robert, because Robert actually arrests Henry when he arrives back in Normandy. He is released, but it obviously isn't a good start to this particular year involving these two individuals. We've also got to see what William II might do at this particular point. We know that he's incredibly rich. We know that he has successfully put down the 1088 rebellion. He's got strong support in England, and he's made Robert of Normandy and his allies look like fools. So what do you do at this particular point? Well, you could go for all-out attack. You could decide, well, let's go for Normandy. Let's try and launch an attack over. Let's go in all-out war. That would be a bit too reckless, particularly noting that William Rufus has only been in power for 2 years, or less than 2 years at this particular point. Now, the work of people like John Gillingham has found out that the chronicles might not have necessarily talked about this particular approach, but if you look at a number of events, you can kind of piece it together. What we think happens is that William Rufus, from about 1089, starts to bankroll nobles in Normandy that are unhappy with the rule of Robert. So he's using the English treasury to bankroll these individuals. And really from 1089 we see problems in terms of Robert controlling areas like so that's EU, and Gournay as well, so that's Gournay. This little destabilizing is kind of a form of espionage, or something that we would expect countries like Russia and America and Britain to be doing in the 21st century. So it's a clever tactic from William. And this continues on into 1090, and 1090 is a period whereby William has got more lords and noblemen in Normandy to destabilise events. So for example, Stephen, Count of Amel, he's one of the main agitators in this. But I just wanted to focus in on one particular moment, because I think this is quite a good anecdote, but also kind of summarises how William, Robert and Henry are operating in this particular year, and involves an individual that William has bankrolled. So around November of 1090, William bankrolls a citizen of Rouen, a man called Conan. So that's Conan. Now he's a leader of a faction within the city that wasn't particularly happy with Robert of Normandy. So the plan was this, that when Robert was asleep in Rouen Castle, that Conan and his followers would open the gates and allow a series of troops that were loyal to William Rufus to go into Rouen Castle and to kill William. Now, the plot was leaked to Robert just in time, and he was able to stop this from happening. But who does Robert go to for help? He goes to his other brother Henry. So they've had their falling out in 1089, but when Robert and William are trying to almost kill each other, Robert asks for help from Henry. And what happens is that Robert and Henry together take this plot. They know when it's going to happen, and they lure the forces of Conan and other people that supported him, particularly this individual called Reginald de Warenne, and they have a pitched battle. It's fierce hand-to-hand street fighting. Henry's the person that's in charge, and the ones that were loyal to Robert and Henry were successful. Conan is captured. He's brought into the castle, and in a great little story, Henry invites Conan to the top of the tower, the top of Rouen Castle, to admire the view and to have a discussion. Once Conan gets to the top of the tower, Henry, when Conan's back is turned, Henry just pushes him out of the window. And in Rouen Castle, all the way to today, there is that particular window, and it's known as Conan's Jump. And it's something that kind of solidified this bond between Henry and Robert. So in 1090, we see an easing of relations between Robert and Henry. William is obviously a main agitator with Robert of Normandy and with Henry as well. So at the beginning of 1091, Robert and Henry are obviously fairly close. William has destabilised, or is trying to destabilise events in Normandy, and is increasingly becoming more and more wealthy, more and more powerful. And in February 1091, William Rufus does something which changes the landscape and the dynamic between the three different brothers. He crosses the Channel from England to Normandy. Now, this is the first time that he's done this as King of England. He's not Duke of Normandy. There is the division of the kingdom, but he has decided that he is going to go over to Normandy and really try and destabilise it even further. He crosses with a large fleet, and they dock in Normandy, and there's a little account here from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that I'll just read to you, which really shows the level of magnitude of this particular invasion force, and we can call it an invasion force. Almost all the Norman magnates eagerly flocked to meet William, bringing him gifts in the hope of receiving greater ones in return. Men from neighbouring provinces of Flanders, Brittany and France, hearing that he was staying at Ur, flocked there too to experience his magnificence and then go home declaring him to be greater than all other princes in wealth and generosity. So William has gone over. Whether it's an invasion force, whether or not it's a propaganda mission, it does have its desired effect. And what happens is something quite momentous in 1091. We call it the Treaty of Cannes, but there's a meeting at Rouen as well. So you can call it the Treaty of Rouen or the Treaty of Cannes. And it involves William and Robert, and just William and Robert. Now, there's a bit more details to the event of the Treaty of Cannes, or the Treaty of Rouen, as it's sometimes called. But there is one main point that you have to understand. It involves their inheritance. Now, William and Robert do share something at this point. Neither of them are married, and neither of them have a male heir. So what William and Robert say to each other is, we need to secure the Norman dynasty, and for the two of us, we need to ensure that there is going to be a clear succession if both of us or one of us dies. So this was the deal, that if one of them died and hadn't had a legitimate son by that particular point, then the other would inherit the whole territory. So for example, if William II died the next day, Robert of Normandy would be Duke of Normandy and King of England. Now, this is a quite a significant moment, as you can imagine. It's essentially saying to each other that they are the other's successor. And let's say, for example, if William II had a male heir, and Robert of Normandy had a male heir, then we would continue to see a division of Normandy and England. This is only if they don't have a male heir. Now, since neither was married, this was something that was to be taken quite seriously at this particular point. So this was securing the inheritance of Normandy and England, but it also solidified the bond between these two brothers after years of conflict. So it's a really surprising turn of events. You know, we got William going over after destabilising Normandy for a number of years, and now we've got this treaty. So we've got to think, well, why is there this treaty then? Why does William, why did William and Robert come to this agreement? Well, it's within both of their interests. William has potentially secured Normandy if Robert doesn't have a male heir. But likewise, he's got a treaty now, almost like a peace treaty, where he knows that Robert isn't going to destabilise any events in England. It's more security more than anything, but it's also pragmatic from William to come up with this particular policy. For Robert, well, it's needed. There's been issues in Normandy of destabilisation. This is going to end that. So it's one of mutual benefit, this particular treaty. But you can see here who's been left out. The person who's been left out is Henry. After helping out Robert in 1090 at the events of Rouen and with Conan, he's been left out of this particular treaty. He's not been involved at all. So we can say actually Henry's got good reason to be annoyed at this. He reacts by doing something very drastic. He puts strongholds at his strongholds at Avranches and Coutances into a state of defence, and he decides to seize the major Norman stronghold of Mont Saint-Michel. We've watched that before when we looked at a documentary before we had the lockdown period. So the first thing that William and Robert have got to do together is, after they've had this treaty, they've now got to take on their brother. So Robert and William have both got to attack Henry at Mont Saint-Michel, and they've got to seize him. Now, Henry's friends deserted him in 1091. In the words of Orderic Vitalis, they feared William's great resources and terrifying power. But really, you've got, if you're looking at this objectively, you've got the King of England and the Duke of Normandy going up against a minor lord. There's only really going to be one winner. William particularly is angry at Henry. This is not the first time that he's gone behind his back and has caused problems for William. And they decide to have a land and sea blockade of Mont Saint-Michel, so they're putting it to siege. Henry runs out of water. He asks for safe conduct. He asks for passage so that he can get drinking water. William doesn't want that. William is fed up with mercy and clemency, but Robert says that he's their brother. He needs to have that. So what happens for Henry is that he is exiled out of Normandy. He goes into France, but William and Robert have successfully put down, not a rebellion, but they've put down a potential threat. And it's not just that. Robert also wanted William's help to help restore authority over Maine. So the two of them decide that that's going to be their next plan of action. Something does happen in 1091, though, that means that William and Robert have to leave Normandy and leave this issue of Maine. The King of Scotland, Malcolm, invades the north of England, and William decides that he's going to put that down. Robert actually goes to help him as well, and we'll look at that particular campaign in a separate lesson. So in summary then, in 1091, William II and Robert of Normandy have probably had their best period as brothers, as fraternal allies. Robert returns to Normandy in Christmas of 1091, after a year in which the two of them have successfully put down revolts. They've spent most of the year together, and they've also signed this major peace treaty. Henry, on the other hand, is disgraced, and he's in exile in France. That's really all that lasts between that strong relationship between William Rufus and Robert of Normandy. 1092 and 1093 are years in where the tension is starting to build up again. There's very little in terms of events of note that we need to talk about, but we need to know that really by the end of 1093, the relationship between William and Robert is beginning to falter again. Henry obviously has been in exile. They're not necessarily, had a better relationship from that. But with William and Robert, by 1093, it isn't necessarily improving. The reasons perhaps for that is down to the fact that William had issues in England. He wanted to focus in on England, and Robert wanted him to help sort this problem out of Maine. William had no intention really of helping him in Maine. And this spills over into 1094. And so on Christmas 1093, Robert of Normandy sends envoys to the court of William Rufus in England, and sets a quite damning comment. He says that unless William went to Normandy and kept the promise that he made from the Treaty of Cannes in 1091, then he would be branded as forsworn. So forsworn means that he's committed perjury, he's sworn falsely. Now that's a very accusatory gesture. So William and Robert, their relationship is definitely over by the Christmas envoys at 1093, and we know that William acts badly to this by what occurs in 1094. So in early 1094, William decides to go to Normandy and to meet with Robert. He meets with him twice during this particular period, but the meetings don't go well. And in March, what William does is he goes on the offensive. He brings an army with him, and it looks like there's going to be an all-out conflict between William and Robert. Robert utilises the support of King Philip of France, and the threat is averted. William goes back to England as a result. Robert, you could say, has the better of 1094. He doesn't lose his lands, but again, William has forced this issue and has shown himself to be the superior force. Interestingly enough, though, with William and Robert falling out in 1094, who does William turn to perhaps have a bit of support? His old exiled brother, Henry. So by the end of 1094, King William Rufus and Robert of Normandy have fallen out, but William Rufus and Henry are now back on speaking terms, and there is now a relationship between the two of them. So finally today, here's your conclusion. Who's had the better 6 years of the three individuals? Have any of them lost anything? Have any of them lost prestige or territories or money? Or do we see really just 6 years of bitter infighting and brotherly squabbles? It's an interesting 6 years, and it's really just a rise and fall of tensions between them. We know that out of all of them, the person with the most money, the most territory, is William Rufus. But perhaps who got the best deal from the 1091 treaty? So those are some questions to think about. 1095 changes everything. 1095 is an important year for you, not just for this particular course, but for your Crusades course. And the decision that Robert of Normandy makes there has, total ramifications, complete ramifications on who's going to inherit the title of King of England following the death of William Rufus. So I'll see you next week where I'll send through your next lesson.